As Liberals celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, many Canadians are wondering, if the Charter couldn't protect our freedoms during COVID, then what is it good for? I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. So as you probably saw, there was a lot in the media last week about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, celebrating the Charter, acting as if that was the creation of Canada, as if Canada didn't have a constitution prior to it, as if Canada wasn't really a country prior to it. Liberals love to hold up the Charter as the sort of golden point of Canadian government and why we have our very freedoms. It was signed into law about 40 years ago in mid-April. So Liberals over at the Globe and Mail celebrated this. They had a piece saying Canada's charter turned 40 on Sunday, and it's still as radical and enigmatic as it was back in 1982. Well, the charter is supposed to protect Canadians' individual rights and freedoms against excessive government force and laws that do not respect our individual dignity and our individual liberty. But as we all experienced during COVID, heavy-handed government edicts routinely upended our most basic human rights. Our religious freedoms were not upheld, as Section 2 is supposed to guarantee. Pastors and church ministers were arrested and jailed for the crime of holding a church service, while meanwhile up the street, Costco and Walmart and big box stores were allowed to stay open with no harassment from the government whatsoever. Also, in Section 2 of the beloved Charter, it lists fundamental freedoms like our right to free speech, to freedom of assembly, to press freedoms, which of course were all violated by Justin Trudeau and his Emergencies Act, which disproportionately used force against peaceful protesters. The Charter is supposed to protect our mobility rights. Let me just read from Section 6. Every citizen of Canada has the right to enter, remain in, and leave Canada. Rights to move and gain livelihood. So every Canadian has the right to move to or take up residence in any province and to pursue the gaining of a livelihood in any province. Now, of course, it has not been the case in Canada for over 2 years now. So many Canadians are still today barred from travel. They can't even flee the country if they wanted to. So today I want to talk more about the Charter and its many failings, and to help me do so, is our friend John Carpay. John Carpay is the founder and president of the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, which was formed as a voice for freedom in Canada's courtroom. John has received the Pyramid Award for Ideas in Public Policy in recognition for his work in constitutional advocacy. The Justice Centre's mission is to defend constitutional freedoms for Canadians through litigation and education. John has devoted his entire legal career to defending constitutional freedoms through litigation and education by resisting the unjust demands of intolerant government authorities. So, John, thank you so much for joining the program.
Glad to be with you, Candice.
Okay, so let's just ask the basic question. Why didn't the Charter protect our freedoms during COVID?
Two reasons come to mind immediately. One is that Canada has too few courts, too few judges, and so it always takes years for important issues to get a court ruling compared to the United States, where they seem to get court rulings on very significant lockdown measures, masks, quarantines, all kinds of issues, and they get their rulings in weeks or sometimes months. And in Canada, it's never in weeks or months. It always takes years. And that's a problem when you've got governments violating our rights and freedoms. We are into the 25th month, 26th month. The hardest part about the 2 weeks to flatten the curve has been the first 2 years. And we don't have too many court rulings yet. We have one in Manitoba, and the other ones are moving through at the pace of molasses in February. So that's one big problem. The second problem is that the Charter Section 1 gives governments the possibility of going to court and concocting justification for violating rights and freedoms. And if that aligns well with the judge, and if the judge is persuaded, then the judge will say, well, yes, okay, this law did violate religious freedom or freedom of association, freedom of peaceful assembly, or this law does violate your right to bodily autonomy to decide for yourself what gets injected into your body or not. But that's okay because the judge thinks that it's reasonable. And so we've got this section 1 of the charter that allows governments to violate our freedoms if they can persuade a judge. And then it's really the luck of the draw. I mean, do you land before a judge who really understands and appreciates fundamental freedoms, who actually demands that the government come forward with persuasive evidence, not just speculation and modeling and fear mongering? Or do you get a judge who's more pro-government? And those judges exist as well.
Well, it seems like there's a lot more of the pro-government judges. From my perspective, it seems like a lot of the judges make their ruling based on their own views rather than being tied to the sort of basic principles of protecting individual rights and freedoms. So, John, why was this Section 1 put into the charter if the whole purpose of the charter was as an addition to our Constitution to make sure that federal government couldn't overreach and that individual rights were protected? If judges were just going to interpret the law based on, well, the government was just trying to do its best, or I agree with these rules and so I'm not going to overturn it. I mean, why was that placed in, and what good is a charter with that in there?
Well, people were warned in 1982. People that looked at the charter closely said, hey, wait a minute, this is going to give unelected, unaccountable judges a lot of power to make rules about our laws. And it's going to give this new legislative power to judges that they've not had before. And this kind of fell on deaf ears. You know, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, at the time, there was television advertisements with, geese flying across the sky. And this is Canada's chance to bring the Constitution home from Britain. And there was not a lot of debate on this question of, do we want a charter that gives judges the power to strike down laws? Now, more specifically, you ask about Section 1, and I would venture a guess that it was put in there to have some kind of a mechanism to recognize that rights are not absolute. And so the wording of Section 1 is that the Charter guarantees rights and freedoms subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Now, it sounds good. So any violation of your freedom of speech, freedom of religion has to be reasonable, and the onus is on the government to justify it demonstrably. It sounds good, but it does give a lot of latitude to judges.
Well, that's unfortunate. I want to ask you, because you mentioned that there was one case that made its way through in Manitoba. Can you, off the top of your head, I don't know if you can you tell us a little bit about what that case is and which rights it seeks to protect?
So we had the Justice Centre acted for some individuals and churches in the province of Manitoba. We took the lockdown measures to court. We brought forward medical doctors, other scientists. We had Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford University in California, world-renowned scientist and one of the co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. We had other medical witnesses, and we put forward very persuasive evidence as to the harm of lockdowns and questioning whether lockdowns were saving lives. We put forward the medical and scientific evidence, and the judge ruled against us and upheld all of these government measures, but didn't really do a deep probing analysis of that evidence, but said, well, in times of crisis, we really should just kind of defer to government. And it wasn't the deep and engaging type of analysis that we would have wanted. And so we have appealed this to the Manitoba Court of Appeal, and we'll see if we do better at that level.
Well, good for you. And I'm curious as to why Manitoba was the place that you chose, because I saw that the JCCF put out a ranking of the worst charter violators among the provinces. It seems like, well, I can ask you for more details on this, but it goes Quebec #1, British Columbia #2, Manitoba was #3. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about this list and then why specifically you chose to do the legislation or do the court case in Manitoba.
So when you're able to launch a constitutional challenge, it's often a constellation of different factors, like having willing clients, having a good fact scenario that's going to put your clients into the best light. So it was just kind of the convergence of various circumstances. It wasn't that we really looked at Manitoba and said, well, we want to do Manitoba, before we do other provinces. It's more like it just came together there first. But we also have litigation against lockdowns or against vaccine passports, or both, in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario. And it's only recently that we've got a full-time lawyer in Quebec. And so we are hoping to do more litigation there as well, but have not been in the past, not as much.
So, well, that's great. Congratulations on getting someone in Quebec. John, why don't you tell us about the ranking, though? What was it that made Quebec the worst offender during COVID? Because I think you could talk to people in just about any province, and they would think that their province was the worst. I know I spent a bunch of time in Ontario during lockdowns, and it was horrible there. Alberta's been bad, people complaining. Most of my family's out in British Columbia, including some unvaccinated family members who've basically been housebound because they can't go places. And, everyone probably feels like they are in the worst place. So how did you come about this ranking, and why was it that you deemed Quebec to be the worst?
So these assessments are somewhat subjective. Somebody else could come along with a different ranking, and it's not a mathematical equation. It's not a science. But we thought Quebec was the worst when you looked at the curfews, which I think Quebec was the only province that had those. Utterly unscientific. The politicians themselves, when asked, are curfews going to save lives? And they said, well, we don't know. But just this fanatical obsession that, if it might help just a little bit, let's just violate people's rights and freedoms, even if we have no idea if it's going to help save lives. We'll do it anyway, just in case it might help. That seems to be the attitude there. So they had curfews. They closed the border with Ontario, which is violation of the Charter mobility rights. They had restrictions on travel within Quebec, depending on whether it was an orange or red or green zone. They were the only province that took it upon, where the government actually thought so highly of itself that it could dictate who does and who does not come into a house of worship. Blatant violation of religious freedom, where instead of the mosque, the synagogue, the church making its own decision about its own house of worship as to who is able to come in or not, the Quebec government said, if somebody's not had the COVID shots, they are not to come into the house of worship. So they basically usurped the legitimate civil authority of private authority of houses of worship to practice their religious freedom by deciding, who comes into the mosque, who does not, and based on what criteria. The government stepped in and told the houses of worship, everybody has to be vaccinated. No other province did that on a province-wide basis, although British Columbia did that for one of its health regions. There's one health region in the north that tried the same thing. Other provinces violated religious freedom less severely. British Columbia did close houses of worship entirely for a year and 2 months, which puts it up right behind Quebec. But to finish off on Quebec, it's just the combination of curfews and telling houses of worship who is or is not allowed to attend, all the travel restrictions, and then all the other lockdowns, and raising the possibility as a serious item for that Premier Legault said, we're going to impose a tax on people that have not had 2 COVID shots, and we're going to bar these people from grocery stores. Now, the government backed down, may have been related to a warning letter received from the Justice Center and from our Quebec lawyer. I don't know. They backed down. But the very fact that the Quebec government would actually seriously consider and announce that they were definitely going to impose a tax on people based on vaccination status. Very last point on Quebec, they still have mask mandates. The only place in Canada, probably the only place in North America, where you have to wear a mask when you're in public spaces.
It's really remarkable that we are still living in this sort of dystopian I mean, John, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the sort of robustness of our institutions, the strength of our ability to sort of move on from COVID. You wrote in a recent op-ed with the JCCF, you compared communism to Canada's pandemic response. You said the utopian goal of communism and the utopian goal of a world with no COVID, both ideologies have been used the same way to trample human rights and constitutional freedoms. I'm wondering, like, when you hear, for instance, conservative politicians say that Trudeau's acting like a dictator, and then the response from the Laurentian elites in the media is just to absolutely clutch their pearls and say, how dare you say something like that about Trudeau? But yeah, at the same time, we've lived through 2 years of just heavy-handed, really, really intensive government overreach. Yeah, I wonder if you could kind of elaborate on your comparison of communism to our COVID reaction, and then speak more broadly about the robustness of Canada to withstand these kind of emergencies that take 2 years to trample on our rights, and we're still not completely out of the woods.
So governments never take your rights and freedoms away without proffering a good pretext or a nice sounding excuse. So dictators need an enemy. Who could be the enemy? Well, it could be, let's look at communist Russia, 1917, right on through to 1991. The enemy is capitalism, capitalists, wealthy landowners, people that oppress the workers. They are the enemy. So in order to fight the enemy and build our socialist utopia, we have to take away your freedom of speech, your freedom of religion, your parental rights to raise your own children as you deem best, your freedom of association, your freedom of peaceful assembly. We're taking away all your rights and freedoms, but it's for your own good, because we got these evil capitalists and aristocrats and landowners and factory owners that are oppressing the proletariat. So we have to fight the bad guys. Therefore, we need to take away your rights and freedoms. Now, that's a dictator's playbook. It's over and over again. Adolf Hitler in Germany said, you have to be very afraid of the communists and the Jews. And so we got to protect Germany from Jews and communists. So we're going to take all your rights and freedoms away. And that's exactly what the Nazis did. As soon as they came to power, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of peaceful assembly, the full freedom of religion, mobility rights, everything was taken away. And a lot of people supported it, sadly. That's another thing about the dictators. Another example would be some right-wing military dictatorships in Latin America. Who do they say the enemy is? The enemy is the communists. So we got to protect you from communists. Therefore, we're going to take away your rights and freedoms, and we're going to lock you up in prison and torture you, and we're going to have death squads, all in the name of fighting communism. Right? The governments have committed horrible atrocities in the name of fighting communism. You've got Idi Amin in Uganda, in East Africa, over 300,000 citizens murdered. And he went after the Asian minority. The 1% of Ugandans were East Indians, and he forced them all out of the country. Many of them came to Canada. So now it's the same playbook. The enemy is not, communism or capitalism or terrorism. The enemy is COVID, and that extends to people that don't want to take the vaccine, whom our prime minister has described as anti-science, misogynist, extremist, racist. Should we tolerate these people? You have that kind of demonization of a minority. And so people who don't see the playbook, I think, are probably just ignorant of history, because it's the same thing. When governments take away your rights and freedoms, they will create an enemy, and they will proffer a nice sounding excuse for taking away your rights and freedoms.
Well, it's so interesting to see, because I think you're completely right in your assessment of what is going on. And yet, John, so many of the people who are doing just what you say, or excusing someone like Justin Trudeau and doing that, were the same people who were out last week, banging the drum of Canadiana, saying how wonderful and enigmatic our charter is. Almost like ignorant of what's in the charter and what the charter was designed to do and what the charter was designed to respect. So why is it that we have people who call themselves liberals, used to wrap themselves in the charter, who are the ones out there, doing that. And we saw it clear as day during the trucker convoy when Justin Trudeau came out on day one after being in hiding and having COVID and whatever else was going on with him, saying these people are Nazis. These truckers are Nazis. So if you're standing with them, you're standing with people waving swastikas. Why don't they have the self-awareness? Why don't they understand what the purpose of the charter is and what the meaning of the term liberty is? How do they square that circle, and why the hypocrisy, why the lack of self-awareness?
Well, anything I say will be speculation, but I think there's a lot of inertia on the part of the so-called mainstream media. Not just the CBC, but other media are getting government funding now. Everything from television stations to newspapers, and he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so you've got government funded media who are preaching and proclaiming and promoting the government's narrative on COVID, on treatments for COVID, on lockdowns, on vaccines, everything in the past 2 years. We've had the mainstream media kind of beating the government's drum, promoting fear, suggesting falsely that COVID is as dangerous as the Spanish flu of 1918, following the government's line on claiming that there are absolutely no cures or treatments for COVID whatsoever, proclaiming this message that lockdowns are saving lives, that lockdowns are doing more good than harm, preaching the gospel on the vaccines, that they are safe and effective. The media have been cheerleaders. Now, fortunately, they are losing credibility every day as more and more people are just tuning out, and more people are getting their news from, their friends, their colleagues, their whatever streams, but they're not getting the media from the 6 o'clock news the way that Canadians were 40 or 50 years ago. So I think that there's a bit of a bubble there, and there's a disconnect. And for Canadians that were not on the ground in Ottawa, it was the mainstream media did push this message that these truckers were dangerous, violent criminals. And sadly, I think that message has probably sunk in to the minds of at least some Canadians, hopefully not too many.
I agree with you that more and more people are tuning out, getting their news directly from the source. That was one of the great things that we saw during the convoy, was that a lot of Canadians were just streaming videos themselves. There were these viral videos going everywhere on TikTok and Instagram with millions of views, particularly among young Canadians on those platforms. But I think even older Canadians, rather than going to the CBC, they might get their news directly from the JCCF or True North or some alternative. So there is some hope. I want to ask you again, though, about Canada's institutions. Do you think we're in a good shape as a country? What do you think of the Charter at 40? What do you think of the broader constitutional structure? How can we make these institutions more robust? What needs to be done?
Boy, that's a very big question. We're in bad shape. We have a breakdown in the rule of law. It was just striking and disgusting to see how the difference in 24 months between the Aboriginal and environmentalist protesters in February and March of 2020. So right around the time that COVID was starting to become an issue, we had people blockading railway lines, making it impossible for ships in Halifax and Vancouver to unload. And the cause they were fighting for was anti-pipeline. In the name of traditional Aboriginal territory, even though the elected chiefs in those areas were pro-pipeline and were looking forward to, the job creation and getting their 80% unemployment rates, which you see on some reserves, getting that down and getting people working. But in the name of Aboriginal rights, in the name of the environment, in the name of, anti-pipelines, we had these protesters that blockaded railway lines in Canada. And the Prime Minister's response was to negotiate and to say, we have to be patient, even though that was definitely criminal conduct, to blockade a railway line, to blockade a highway and prevent any traffic, not just slowing down traffic, but an outright prohibition on train travel. So then fast forward to 2021, We've got vandals in Manitoba at the legislature tearing down and vandalizing a statue of Queen Victoria, which is criminal conduct, and police just stand by and watch. And then we get the truckers in Ottawa, not a single trucker charged with any crime in the first 3 weeks that they're there, which tells you just how not illegal their behavior was when there wasn't a single criminal charge. So there's no charges laid, no arrests made. And then you get this crackdown where the Prime Minister imposes martial law on the country, the Emergencies Act, and declares a national emergency. And next thing you know, we've got police horses trampling women. You've got unarmed protesters getting beaten by police clubs. And you get this aggressive physical repression of a peaceful protest. So the double standard is glaring. That where we're at in Canada is that if you're demonstrating for a cause that the Prime Minister is sympathetic to, even if you're blatantly breaking the law, you're not going to get in trouble. Conversely, if you're protesting for a cause that the Prime Minister disagrees with, like our charter rights and freedoms that have been taken away from us the past 2 years, well, then we're going to have ruthless physical suppression of peaceful protest. That double standard is a violation of the rule of law, and it's very, very scary.
Well, and you forgot in there that during the very, very beginning of the pandemic, right when no one really knew what it was, and everyone was told to just stay inside to avoid catching this thing, all of a sudden we had a American-inspired Black Lives Rally movement that swept across Canada, even though it had nothing to do with our history or our justice system or our policing. And the Prime Minister himself went out to that protest right, spring of 2020 when COVID was brand new, and then you had a bunch of epidemiologists and doctors saying that fighting against racism was so righteous and just that you couldn't catch COVID from getting it. So, we've had those contradictions for a long, long time. John, it's not a healthy society when, you have a Prime Minister who routinely breaks ethics rules and, gets a slap on the wrist and gets to continue on. It's not a healthy society, what you just described. So I just had a final question for you here. We talked a little bit about how most of the restrictions are lifted, but they're not all lifted, particularly there's still many restraints on people who are unvaccinated. Further lockdowns are looming. We never know when they're just going to get brought back in. It seems like the provincial government doesn't want to let go of those powers just yet. So what is the JCCF doing to protect us going forward? And how can Canadians ensure that our rights are protected and that this doesn't just keep happening again and again and again?
Well, we've got court actions across the country, but I've often said that the winning in the court of public opinion is even more important than winning in the court of law, because if public opinion changes and people recognize how harmful and destructive and how utterly unscientific these measures are and have been, when that public opinion changes, you're going to see change in the law. So the best thing that people can do is to try as much as possible to be in dialogue with others. Some people, you got people on both extremes that you can't talk to. I mean, some people, they're just 100% pro lockdown. They don't want to hear anything. They completely buy into the government and media narrative. And there's other people, equally passionate on the other side that are not going to be persuaded that lockdowns were good. But there are people in the middle that are not firmly decided either way. Those are the people that need to be reached. So people can, hand out brochures. The Justice Center has mailed out hundreds of thousands of brochures to people that will get a pack of 50 or 100, put them in the mailboxes of their neighbors. If anybody wants to do that, contact info@jccf.ca. Ask for brochures about our charter rights and freedoms and the problems with the vaccine passport, those kinds of things. Give out brochures to people, but do the heavy lifting, do the hard work of persuading people that are in the middle, that are open to being persuaded, because the way out of this, unfortunately, is just going to be a lot of hard work to change public opinion. And apart from that, I think the repression is going to continue if we don't change public opinion.
Well, I think that certainly with the trucker convoy, there was a little bit of optimism and good news there, because the fact that the truckers went out there, they were greeted on the side of highways in minus 30-degree weather by families and people waving Canadian flags. And many people did rally around those truckers. Many more appreciated them silently at home or quietly, and you're hearing more and more of that. So, definitely the truckers changed the tone, and I think that the work that the JCCF does is incredibly important in pushing back against just out of control government overreach and activism. So, John, we really appreciate what you do. Thanks for your time and coming on the show, and we hope to have you back again soon. Thanks so much for the invitation. All right, that's John Carpay of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. You can check out their website at jccf.ca. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.